Hey guys, so last time we left off with our completion of our form load event. So I'm just going to click start real quickly, load up this form and see if what we wrote actually works. Now of course you have to make sure you have your database up, everything is connected, and then you press F5 or click start to bring up your form. So I'm just going to go to user management, and if all goes well, then we should see on load certain things appearing. So here we do gender, we see the two genders appearing as informed by our database. And to the right, you'll see that our grid is populated with some users that I was testing before. Now, just to take a look at these values and take into consideration certain things that are not the way they should be, and certain things that you have to be cognizant of when writing the code to save records. One, we need to include validation. So we see here that we have two users with the same username and with the same email address. That is a big no-no. No properly designed system actually has that, and we want to have a properly designed system. So evidently we have to do a check to ensure that we mitigate against any of that happening. Also, we have a user here with no email address, so we need to enforce a rule or enforce validations that will stipulate that email addresses are required when creating a user. So we can just go ahead and close that, get back to our Visual Studio, and then we can start creating our code for saving a user. So we can double click this button to get a click event. That's the quickest way, and some of these functions will look familiar, but as we go along we will expound on what needs to be done. Now the first order of business, having created the form and looking to save data from the form, is to actually get the data from the form. So we know our controls in our text boxes, we need to get the relevant data from them, one. Two, we need to validate this data. Three, if it is valid, we need to attach a record with this data to our database and for save changes. So the first step in all of that is to get the data from the database. So I'm just going to do that real quickly and we'll see how that goes. Alright, so here I populated my click events method stub with some data, with some code, which is scraping information from our form. I call it scraping. It's not really scraping. We're just getting the text values or the selected value in the case of the combo box. And then we, of course, will want to save a gender ID. So we have to ensure that whatever we're getting a selected value is an integer. And we're just getting all of the text values that would have been stored in the relevant text box controls. Now you may notice that I am missing a password field. If you look in my database, you'll see that a password is supposed to be in the user's record. I did not include that control on the design view. I will, however, set the password in the backend. Now there are a few things to note about the password. One, a password should never really be stored as plain text. Never, ever, ever. For this example, I'll do it and I'll expound on how you go about encrypting it at a later date, but I'm just instilling that from now. Never store it as plain text. Alright, so I'm going to randomly generate a password. I'm going to use the user's first name, maybe their first initial, append that to their last name, and append a random number between 0 and 100. Let's see how that can go. So firstly, because I know I need a random number, I'm going to declare a variable for this random number. So var rand equals new random. There we go, little typo. Alright, now that we have our random generating token, I'm just going to declare my password. And I'm going to set its value to some form of string. I'm going to use C# new concatenation method, and I'm going to concatenate fname and I'm going to take the first character. So that's the character that's at index 0 of this string, because by now we should know that a string is really a character array. We'll take on lname. So I'm appending the first initial to the last name, and then I will append the value that is being randomly generated to rand.next, and I want a random value between 0 and 100. So that's, well, we know the pattern. The person who's creating the user doesn't necessarily know the pattern, but I'm just showing you all of what is possible when it comes to the realm of C# coding. Now, having gotten all of this data, we need to start running our validations. So we need to check, one, is the form valid? Now, a validation check might be done more than once. You maybe want to validate the data during a creation. You want to validate the data during an update. For this reason, I have a philosophy that if I have to type a block of code more than once, or if it's going to be used more than once, I just put it in a function. So I have a function here that is saying it's returning a boolean, and it's titled is form invalid. And my validation, and this is my validation, you can have your own. You maybe don't need as much validation as I do, or maybe you want more. That's entirely up to you. But I just want to check really if empty or null string was submitted for the email address, and if an empty or null string has been submitted for the username. And then it's going to return, if either one is true, it will return true, and if neither is true, it will return false. All right. So of course, if this returns false, then we're good to go. That is what this is saying. All right. So in keeping with that, I can say if, and I'll just say if is form invalid. So that means if my form is invalid, then I want to display a message box to my user to say, and just close that. I'm going to display a message box that says, please validate all data before submission. Nice friendly message with an exclamation mark. Please validate all your data before you click submit. The next one, I'm going to say else if, and then I'm now going to check if the username is used or the password is used. So we already established at the start of the video that we should never have two of the same usernames or two of the same email addresses inside our database. So I'm going to say else if, and I want to check if the email exists or the username exists. So I have two functions also doing that, and I probably would want to do that on an update. So once again, I would write this code twice, so I put it in a function, and then I'll call the function according to the situation. So in check email, it's just going to return a boolean, check the user's table in the database to see if there is any email that matches the email address being passed into this function. And the email address we'd want to pass into this function is coming from our email address text box. Now, if there is any, it will return true, and if there is none, it will return false. Here, I am running another operation. This is a string operation called trim. What trim does is remove all white space to the left or to the right of our text. So we don't want somebody to type in test.com space, which would then be a different string from the same email address without that many spaces. And so by trimming, we're eliminating any possible space that may obscure the result and give us a bad reading. So if this returns true, so I'll just say check email, and that's the beauty of programming, where you can just write it in right here, and I'll just pass in the email coming in from this variable. All right, and then I'm doing a very similar check for my username. it's the same code really, it's just checking different fields. So its username exists and it's the same code, checking the database and the users table if there's any username that matches the username that was passed into it. So I'm going to say if check email returns true, or if check username returns true. I'll pass username in this one. If either one returns true, then I would like to display a message box and I want to show the message that either, let's just say a user exists with this email / username. All right, so if the form is not valid and is form invalid, if that value is the true, then we display a message saying please validate all the data. Else, if the form is valid, we have all the data points, but then we have an email address that exists already or a username that exists already, then we want to display a message box to say, hey, no, you can't move forward with that. Else, however, having done all of our validations, you may have more, you may have fewer than I do, but having completed them all, I'm just collapsing these. Having completed them all, then we want to start our preparation to actually add the user to the database. All right. So let us go ahead and start creating our user record. So the first thing we do is create an object of type user, and this is a transferable pattern. This is a pattern that you use in Entity Framework. You identify the data type or the entity data type that is associated with the table you're about to manipulate. You create a record in that data type, and then you proceed to add this record or this object to the database context and save changes. And we're about to do that step by step. So firstly, I use my magic var keyword and I declare an object of type new user. And then I'm going to use C#'s simple initialization, where I simply type out the class name and then I use the curly brace, and then inside the curly braces I can just start typing the property and setting the value. So first name would take on the value fname, last name would take on the value lname, and I'm just going to fill these out real quickly. So I fill these out real quickly, put on the email, the username, the gender ID. Remember, gender ID is an integer and we have to make sure that we're sending up an integer as per this line. Our password, which we generated here, and then date created, I just set that to date time now on demand, and this block of code ends with a semicolon. Now, having declared and initialized our object with all the values that we need, we now call on our database context. We call on our table that we're about to manipulate, which is our users, and then we specify that we're about to add a record. Then we pass as the parameter the newly created user object into the users list. This is really just a collection of users. That's what that represents, right? So we're adding to the collection of users. It's really standard English, right? And we're adding this user to the collection of users in our database. And then after doing that, we want to save changes to our database context. Now, having done all of this, we saw that we have 4 users right now. Having added a 5th, it would be nice if we saw that happen near real time. Now, this is one of those situations where I mentioned that we would have to kind of maybe run the query a second time for the grid view and refresh its components. So after adding and saving changes, we would then refresh grid view. All right, so in part 1 we went through all of the code that is in refresh grid view. We saw what it does, so I'm just leveraging that same function inside of my save. So after all of this has been completed, we will then reload the grid view, which would then pull the new user and have it on display. I also have another function here, reset form. This clears all the details and contents of any control that was being filled out, you know, during that whole registration process. So I'll just reset the form having completed that process. All right. And then of course, as we go along, we try and control shift and B to make sure that we are not getting any errors and that everything knows all the references across the project. As a final act, once again, and I left it out this time so we could do it together, we always try to wrap all of our operations inside of a try catch. So I'm just going to add try up top here, and then I'm going to put all of the code we just wrote inside of the try area, and then I'm going to set up a custom message box alert in case an error actually occurred while trying to do all of this. So I'm just going to cut this and then paste it inside of our try. And then after all of that, if there's an exception that is caught, I'm going to just put a space here beside the word exception and put in something. This doesn't necessarily have to be called EX. It just means I want to declare an object of type exception, and then this object will then embody details of what went wrong. So I'm just going to say message box dot show, and I'm going to type in a very non-panicky or threatening manner, a fatal error has occurred. Well, there has been a fatal error. There has been a fatal error. And then I can just concatenate on the details of this error using my exception object called EX, and I'll print the message. That's the exception message. Now, it's not every situation you'd probably want to display to your user that, oh, this is the exception that has happened. You could just give them a graceful, hey guys, sorry about that, something went wrong. But then in the background, you actually fire off an email with the exception and any other details that could help you debug it while the user is experiencing the issue. So that is essentially what my btn save click event looks like, and I'm just going to run it right now, and we'll see if what we have done is as groundbreaking as I am making it out to be. So we have users, user management, and I'm going to add one Pippi long stockings. Her email address is pip@stock.com, and her username is Pippi, and gender is female. And then I click save user, and there we go. Reset form fired, our save user fired, and our refresh grid fired. So you see everything is firing and working. And if I had another one, then the expected behavior should obtain. Now if I try to save a user without adding anything, this one says that a fatal error has occurred because there's something else that would have gone wrongly, even, well, by virtue of the fact that I left all of this blank. It wasn't as simple as, oh, it's invalid. There was a deeper rooted error that would have occurred. But notice the program did not crash. It just said, hey, there was an error, and then move along. All right, so that's what the try catch allows you to do. And then I know exactly why I got that error. So I'm just going to force past that error, and then we see here that we're validating. We don't have a valid last name and email address, or is it username and email address, sorry, because they're blank, right, based on our validation rules that we would have set up. So remember, is form valid? We're checking if the email address is blank and if the username is blank, and because they're both blank, it's returning true either way. So there's that. And then if I fill this in, So I'm going to try and put in pip at stock.com, and well, I'll just put in something random. So we should validate if the username exists or if the email address exists. So it doesn't really matter which one of these I duplicate. When I do this, the validation should say a user exists with this email/username. So it's just knowing that there's somebody there with it already. I can't add you. All right, so having done all of that, if I just add on a one and make it different, and then I click save user, then our form behaves the way we intend. So that's it for this lesson, guys. Go ahead and experiment. I will add comments to this code and upload it to the repo. That's the A_A working project. _B already has all of the bells and whistles for the CRUD in it, so you can browse at will. All right, thanks for listening and do enjoy this activity.